For this, the British wanted war.
But a war could not be declared over opium, an illicit, illegal contraband commodity. The British Parliament couldn't certainly declare war with China over an illegal drug. An excuse had to be found.
Jardine and Matheson of Hong Kong, two men prominently trafficking in opium who had become members of Parliament, presented the excuse.
The Chinese character E meant barbarian. Barbarian was used to describe Europeans. Europeans thought it was arrogant and insulting. China was deemed unfit to be a member of the family of nations. And former American President John Quincy Adams also leapt in to agree with the British. China had a moral obligation to trade with nations because commerce was founded entirely on the Christian precept to love your neighbor as yourself. China's refusal to trade was an enormous outrage and should cease.
China had to be taught a lesson.
The British attack in China began. Our weapons were no match for theirs. We thought ourselves in need of nothing from the West. We were wrong. We needed their cannons. The invasion of Peking was an Allied invasion, British and French together. And when Lord Elgin ordered the burning of the Imperial Summer Palace, our emperor gave in. China lost the two opium wars. China lost too much. No sooner than the Treaty of Nanjing between Britain and China was signed, the Americans also maneuvered a separate U.S.-China treaty to wrest the same treaty benefits for themselves. And soon after this, across the Yellow Sea in Japan, learning from this experience in China, America sent Matthew Perry sailing into Tokyo Bay with his warships to force open Japan as well to trade. The Japanese did not like Perry or his American fleet. They called them the Black Ships. We lost Hong Kong and Kowloon to Queen Victoria and her successors. We had to open 12 treaty ports to Westerners, not just one in Canton as before. And in these treaty ports, Westerners were allowed to inhabit privileged parts of the city, separate from Chinese society, not subject to Chinese law. American Christian missionaries were now free to move anywhere in China in search of our heathen souls to save. We were no longer equal. We lost control in our own land. But most faithfully of all, the British were now given the power to preside over the immigration of our people abroad, hitherto illegal, so that when the African slave trade ended, all the world could freely come to the treaty ports to find and export Chinese laborers on a global scale. That is how the Chinese laborer, industrious and honorable, became the Chinese coolie, someone both sought after and despised.
The coolies had on their bare chests the painted letters of their destination, P for Peru, C for Cuba, and S for the Sandwich Islands.
The slave trade was ended and there was a shortage of labor. And this is when the coolie trade involving Chinese and Indians began. If you use the word slaves, it seems to imply that being slaves was a natural condition of Africans, when in fact, the term I prefer is enslaved Africans, meaning somebody else did this to them.
After the end of the slave trade in the British Empire in the early 1800s, some of the Atlantic traders went to Asia to get laborers for the plantations in the New World as replacements for African slaves. They went to places like India, but also to China.
We Asian Indian and Chinese coolies left our homelands traveling very different routes. The Chinese voyaged eastward across the Pacific Ocean and around South America to arrive in the West Indies. Peru, the Guianas, Trinidad, Panama, Jamaica, Cuba. The Asian Indians went westward across the Indian Ocean and around Africa. But in the end, we met in the same places, the plantations and mines of the Americas and the Caribbean.
The word coolie is an Indian word. No, others say, it is a Chinese word. They both claim the word because it names the experience they had in common. Today, in Cuba and Peru, we can still see coolies in the faces of the descendants and villagers who followed in their footsteps.
I mean, 50% Chinese, 50% Cuban.
Mi papá chino, mi mamá cubana.
Tu papá es chino y tu mamá cubana.
There is a very broad pattern developing that encompassed the whole world. Asians were injected into the system in particular ways, which then affected how they were treated.
Chinese coolies were transported in a system called by the British historian Hugh Tinker a new system of slavery, because indeed these were in exchange for the former African slaves. They were replacements of these African slaves. The Chinese called it the buying and selling of pigs.
咁啊，幾代嚟嘅人嚟講呢，都係到外邊賣紙仔做苦力嘅。我祖父嚟講呢，三兄弟呢就賣紙仔嘅。我阿爸嚟講呢，就四兄弟。 都係去古巴嘅。條村嚟講呢，一共有13人去古巴嘅。真正能夠翻嚟嘅，即係個吉頭翻嚟嘅早嫁埋葬嘅嚟講呢，梗係2個人，一個我阿爸，一個我三叔。其餘呢都係喺古巴做咗好地嘅。
What happened? How could they be persuaded to work in places from which they did not return?
The recruiters, called crimps, seemingly our trustworthy friends, kinsmen, acquaintances, lured us with promises of employment as temporary soldiers with the Imperial Army or cooks and servants for French troops stationed in Canton. They lied that the work was nearby, tricked us into crooked gambling games, then offered a way to work off disastrous gambling debts. So, many of us would sign contracts as indentured workers, consenting to bonded labor for a limited time, not knowing the paper was virtually worthless and could not be enforced. When persuasion, lies, and tricks did not work, then we were simply kidnapped off the streets of Canton in broad daylight and wrestled to detention in the jails in Macau for shipping abroad. Local people, seeing this, were outraged and attacked the cribs. They beat and hanged. They stoned recruiter officers. All the while, the coolie ships of many European countries were impatiently waiting in the harbor for the cribs to deliver our villagers to the great profit and to our lasting misery.
African slave ships were the models for Chinese coolie ships. Bunks on the coolie ships were simply 3 rows of shelves running the whole length of the ship, with each man allotted the width of his shoulders. With no separation between men, each shelf was simply 150 men sleeping in one bed. And if trading goods like tea could make you a millionaire, as with the Hong merchant Hao Kwa, trading in coolies as if they were goods could make you 10 times more rich than tea. Of course, they had to be delivered alive.
You must know, we did not just accept these terrible things done to us. How could they treat us in such a manner and still be men? There was no peace on these ships. One voyage in every 11 had a mutiny. Bands of us hurled ourselves upon them, trying by our sheer numbers to take control of the ship. If our demands are not met, we will burn the ship. We have nothing to lose. In our gamble for liberty, some captains, hundreds of sailors, thousands of coolies died. But we also succeeded in 13 mutinies and gained our freedom.
But as for the many others who went on to Cuba, their treatment was so bad that the Chinese government had to send a commission to investigate for themselves. The China Commission questioned the coolies directly.
We told the commission, on landing in Cuba, foreigners on horseback, armed with whips, herded us like cattle to the barracoon jails to be sold. We were divided into 3 classes, first, second, and third, and forced to remove all our clothes so that our person might be examined and the price fixed. This covered us with shame.
How do employers treat coolies? They answered with their names.
We labor 21 hours out of 24 and are beaten. 200 blows, and though my body a mass of wounds, still forced to continue labor, so that a single day becomes a year, and our families know not whether we are alive or dead, or where we are. We 9 all set forth to lay a complaint before the authorities, but were sent back, tied up, and flogged. I saw 6 men hang themselves.
Can you choose between staying and leaving Cuba?
On the termination of my contract, I was refused release papers and confined in prison for 6 years, laboring but receiving no wages.
When a man dies, what happens?
We have been here